Okay, so this is a new type of video that I'm making. In this type of video, I'll be going over different types of cases and kind of give it to you as a question. You're supposed to pause, think about what you think it is, and then I'll give you a hint. After the hint, if you can't get it, I'll go over the explanation and kind of try to teach you what it is. I think this is a better format because, especially for term fives, or people who are studying with step one in mind, and that's because it's kind of like getting you to focus on problem solving rather than memorizing content. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm gonna adjust my screen a little bit. I want to have my notes here. Okay, so what if they give you a case and wait, they describe a young girl, let's say, was failure to thrive, so hasn't been gaining weight, let's say 11 months, hasn't been gaining weight, is like 20% height, 20 percentile for weight. And the patient is hypotonic and has muscle wasting. Her glucose is in the 60s. Her serum creatine kinase is high. Okay. And but lactic acid is normal. Okay. Now, what do you think this is? Pause the video and think about it. I'll give you a hint after if you're not able to tell what it is. Okay, so the hint is it's one of the glycogen storage diseases. Now pause it again if you weren't able to figure it out the first time and try to tell me which one it is. Or if you don't know what the name is, try to tell me which enzyme has a problem or what does that enzyme do. Again, it's about learning the concepts rather than memorizing the names. So if you're able to describe to me what the enzyme is supposed to do, that's good still. All right, so let's get to the explanation part. Okay, so before we start answering this question, well, the answer is Cori disease, right? Um, so Cori disease, basically, if you remember the A, B, C, D, right? A stands for Anderson's disease, and I think it's type 4. Um, A is branching, so in Anderson's disease, they don't have the branching enzyme. That means they're not able to synthesize new glycogen. And C is for Cori. Cori, I think, is type 3, right? And D is for debranching. So they lack the debranching enzymes. So if they lack the debranching enzyme, as this patient does, they're not able to produce glucose from glycogen. So they would get hypoglycemia, as this patient did, right? But they also uh, will have, this patient also has, in addition to the liver problem that's evident by the hypoglycemia, she also has muscle problem, right? Uh, that's why, and she also has normal lactic acid. So when I saw normal lactic acid, type 1, so type 1, if you remember, is von Gerke, 1G, right? And von Gerke is the enzyme that's involved here is glycogen phosphorylase, right? Sorry, glucose phosphorylase. Uh, yeah, phosphatase. That's basically when you have glucose and you've gone through gluconeogenesis. The last step, the glucose is still attached to the phosphate. You need to cleave the phosphate to release the glucose, right? So these guys, von Gerke's, they don't have this last enzyme that breaks down this bond and releases the phosphate and releases the glucose, right? So these guys also have hypoglycemia, but what's more important is that you have high lactic acid, right? And that's because when you're like kind of like, so think of like gluconeogenesis, you got pyruvate here, right? That goes to glucose, And if you're blocking it at this level, it means all the stuff that are down here, there's going to be more of them now. And because they have nowhere to go, lactic acid is one of the products, or is something you can make out of pyruvate. So you end up making a lot of lactic acid. You also end up making a lot of acyl-CoA, and this leads to fat synthesis. One more thing that von Guericke has is that through the same mechanism, it feeds into production of purines and pyrimidines, and these people get gout, right? The other thing is 6-glucose phosphate. This molecule activates the enzyme that produces glycogen. So these people will produce a lot of glycogen in where glucose, so they produce a lot of glycogen in their livers and kidney. So they get massive livers and massive kidneys, right? This was all type 1. Now the reason this case is in type 1 is because the main thing that rules it out is lactic acid, right? You expect lactic acidosis in type 1, but here we don't have lactic acid, okay? The other thing, let's talk about type 2, and then when we get to Corey, we'll kind of talk more about the case. Type 2 is Pompe disease, right? So the way I remember this is the main thing you got to concern yourself about in this disease is, I think the most important thing about this disease is that it can lead to heart failure, right? And rather early on, okay? So most of the questions I've seen about this disease is about that. But the way I remember it is that it sounds like a pump and the heart pumps blood out, right? So the enzyme that's defective here is called acid maltase. Acid maltase. So if you remember, when glucose molecules bind together, they can either bind like this. So they can either bind in a line, or once in a while, some of them can go like in branches like this, okay? The ones that are in a line are 1,4 alpha bonds, right? These ones are 1,6 alpha bonds, right? I don't know if it's alpha or beta, but it's 1,4 and 1,6. Okay, is it alpha? I'm trying to think of biochemistry. Maybe it's beta, I don't know. Okay, now acid maltase, I think, is a 1,4 and 1,6, and the important thing about it is that it is in the lysosomes. Okay, so it's a glycogen storage disease. It's also a lysosome disease. These guys also have proximal muscle wasting that leads to respiratory failure. Okay. Now the third disease, which is the clinical case that I described for you, is Corey, right? So as you mentioned before, if you remember the ABCD, the CD means Corey is debranching. So it basically means you can't release glucose out of glycogen, okay? When you can't release glucose out of glycogen, the phenotype you have is pretty similar to your type 1s, your von Guericke's, with slight differences. First of all, it's not as intense as von Guericke. Von Guericke gives very intense hypoglycemia. In case of Corey, it's a little less intense because in von Guericke, glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, so breaking down glycogen and making glucose out of nothing, those are both impaired. So your liver can't release any glucose. But in the case of Corey disease, you still can do gluconeogenesis, so you can still make glucose out of nothing. But glycogenolysis, breaking down glycogen, is impaired, okay? So you still have low glucose, but it's not as bad as von Guericke. But more importantly, you don't have lactic acidosis. And that's because, as I mentioned here, the problem, the problem isn't with this enzyme. The problem, this pathway is all right, okay? So you don't get the feedback, you don't get like stuff, you don't get high pyruvate, and therefore you don't get lactic acidosis, you don't get more fat synthesis, you don't even get gout, okay? Oh, and I guess goes without saying, when you're talking about branching, we were talking about these stuff, the 1,6 bond. So in the deep branching, the enzyme is a 1,6. This is an enzyme that breaks a 1,6 uh, bond. All right. Then again, as the ABCD mnemonic goes, the next disease is A, Anderson's, right? This is disease 4, and it's Anderson's. And it's, which this is the branching, right? So this disease is characterized by cardiomyopathy and proximal myopathy, okay? Proximal myopathy, proximal muscles are muscles that are close to the center of the body. So it's associated with respiratory insufficiency. The other important disease is McArdle's. McArdle is type 5. SU put a lot of emphasis on McArdle, so you probably remember a lot about it. But the defect in McArdle is, if I'm not mistaken, it's glucose phosphatase, right? But specifically in the muscle, okay? And it's associated with a second wind phenomena, okay? Now what that means is that after a little bit of time, the muscle is able to uh, get back to its original strength. It's called the second wind phenomena. They can describe it as someone who works out and then gets tired really fast, and then after 10 minutes is okay, it's ready to go again. And then the next disease is Her's disease. Her's is type, what's that, 6? Yeah. And the enzyme that's defective is liver phosphorylase. Okay. So as you can tell me, liver phosphorylase. Oh, and sorry, for McArdle, I said glucose phosphatase. It's glycogen phosphatase. And with Her's, it's glycogen liver phosphatase. So this is basically the ability to break down glycogen. Because when you want to break down glycogen, if it's like these chain of glucose molecules, first thing you gotta do is you gotta phosphorylate them, okay? Um, phosphatase, yeah. So these guys aren't able to break down these glycogens, okay? All right, so this is the first case. Next case is about, this video is going to be only 2 cases. This case is much shorter because I don't have to go into a lot of detail about the new disease, or a bunch of other diseases rather. With next case is, let's say, a young woman in her mid-20s, sexually active, one partner, a boyfriend, and she experiences pain when peeing, basically, so dysuria, and she's got frequent urinations, okay? And also the question tells you the leukocyte esterase is detectable, but when we are doing gram staining, we don't see anything, okay? So pause the video, think what it could possibly be. Now, I don't really have a hint for this. I guess I don't have a hint that makes sense for this. Actually, yeah, I'm going to tell you that the hint is the organism is intercellular, okay, and that's why you're not able to stain it. Okay, that should have narrowed it down a lot. And also, let's say the choices are gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomonas, uh, bacterial vaginosis, and candida. Well, out of the ones I mentioned, the only one that's intercellular is chlamydia, okay? And that is your answer. So the catch here is that chlamydia doesn't stain just because it's intercellular. That's literally the only thing. Um, and also, with something like candida, you expect to see hyphae, but you also expect to see discharge. We don't have any discharge in this case, right? Same with bacterial vaginosis, you'd expect to see gram variable, meaning gram positive and gram negative stuff, but also you'd expect to see discharge, more specifically discharge with fishy odor. That's kind of like grayish. With trichomonas, you'd expect to see greenish discharge. You'd also expect to see strawberry cervix. Also, with trichomonas, on like microscopy, you see a parasite with flagella. Uh, I guess the other point is that what do you give this guy or girl you that has chlamydia? You give him azithromycin, which is a macrolide, or tetracycline. Uh, so I'm sure, well, tetracycline is they're typically good for intercellular bugs, and that's simply because they get higher concentration. They accumulate intercellularly. So all tetracyclines. Uh, Actually, I think specifically you give him doxycycline. I'm just talking about, but tetracycline as a class of drug, the reason you give them to intercellular parasites or intercellular bugs is because they concentrate inside the cell. But the specific type of tetracycline you give them is doxycycline. And you also give them ceftriaxone. Now you might be thinking, okay, ceftriaxone is a beta-lactam. These guys, they don't have a cell wall, and that's why they don't really stain with gram staining, right? So why give them ceftriaxone? And the answer to that is that we're not giving them ceftriaxone for the chlamydia. We're giving them ceftriaxone for the possibility that they also got gonorrhea at the same time as chlamydia. We also do the same thing when a patient has gonorrhea. We give them azithromycin or doxycycline because gonorrhea and chlamydia, for whatever reason, I mean, the reason is obvious because if you have one, you're more likely to have the other one because you probably engage in behaviors that have higher risk. So when someone has chlamydia, we also, even if we don't test positive, even if they don't test positive for gonorrhea, we give a medication that treats gonorrhea. And if someone has gonorrhea, we give a medication that's chlamydia. Okay? All right. This is all for this video. Oh, I'm gonna pause this video now.